They say the most expensive rooms in the world are not defined by their chandeliers, but by the judgments quietly exchanged beneath them. On that evening in Manhattan, the DeLuca estate held one of those rooms. Crystal light spilled across polished marble floors. Silverware rested untouched on linen that had been pressed hours before the guests arrived. Men with measured voices and tailored suits stood in small circles, speaking in fragments. Politics, shipping routes, quiet alliances. Women in silk gowns watched everything without appearing to look. It was not just a wedding. It was a gathering of power. And in rooms like this, every detail mattered. Especially the bride. They had expected someone else. Someone younger. Someone polished. Someone who could stand beside a man like Vittorio DeLuca and look appropriate. So when Elena Rossi stepped into the room, the shift was immediate. It wasn't loud. Not here. Nothing important ever was. But it was there, in the slight pause of conversation, in the glance that lasted a second too long, in the way one woman leaned closer to another and whispered something that didn't need to be heard to be understood. Elena did not fit the image. Her dress was simple. Not cheap, but restrained almost deliberately so. No extravagant jewelry. No attempt to compete with the room she had just entered. And her face, unadorned by the kind of careful illusion the others had perfected, carried something far less common. Stillness. Not confidence in the way the room understood it. Not charm. Not performance. Just stillness. A man near the bar exhaled softly, shaking his head. DeLuca could have married anyone, he muttered, not quite quietly enough. His companion gave a small, dismissive smile. Maybe he lost a bet. A few restrained laughs followed. Polite, controlled, but sharp enough to land. Across the room, Elena heard it. She didn't react. Didn't turn. Didn't stiffen. Didn't give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She simply continued walking. Measured. Unhurried. As if she had already accounted for this moment long before it arrived. At the far end of the hall stood Vittorio DeLuca. He had not moved since she entered. Tall, composed, his presence carried the kind of authority that did not need reinforcement. Conversations adjusted around him without direction. Space formed where he stood, as though the room itself understood his boundaries. He watched her approach. Not the way the others did. There was no curiosity in his expression. No surprise. No discomfort. Only attention. Careful. Precise. The kind of attention that measured more than appearance. When Elena reached him, there was no theatrical greeting. No exaggerated affection for the benefit of the room. Just a quiet acknowledgement. You're on time, Vittorio said. His voice was low even. Elena met his gaze. I prefer to understand a room before it changes. For a brief moment, something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but not indifference either. Around them, the whispers continued. A woman in emerald silk tilted her head slightly. She doesn't even try, she murmured. Doesn't she know where she is? Another responded, softer still. Oh, she knows. That's the problem. Near the entrance, a younger man, Carlo DeLuca, Vittorio's cousin, watched with open amusement. He didn't bother lowering his voice. This is what we're celebrating, he said, raising his glass slightly. A ghost in a wedding dress? A few nearby guests chuckled, more openly this time. Carlo's confidence was different from Vittorio's. Louder. Less disciplined. The kind that needed witnesses. Elena's eyes moved, not toward Carlo, but past him. Toward the staff. It was subtle. Almost imperceptible. But S didn't turn. Didn't stiffen. Didn't give them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She simply continued walking. Measured. Unhurried. As if she had already accounted for this moment long before it arrived. At the far end of the hall stood Vittorio DeLuca. He had not moved since she entered. Tall, composed, his presence carried the kind of authority that did not need reinforcement. Conversations adjusted around him without direction. Space formed where he stood, as though the room itself understood his boundaries. He watched her approach. Not the way the others did. There was no curiosity in his expression. No surprise. No discomfort. Only attention. Careful. Precise. The kind of attention that measured more than appearance. When Elena reached him, there was no theatrical greeting, no exaggerated affection for the benefit of the room, just a quiet acknowledgement. "You're on time," Vittorio said. His voice was low even. Elena met his gaze. "I prefer to understand a room before it changes." For a brief moment, something shifted in his expression. Not quite approval, but not indifference either. Around them, the whispers continued. A woman in emerald silk tilted her head slightly. "She doesn't even try," she murmured. "Doesn't she know where she is?" Another responded, softer still. "Oh, she knows. That's the problem." Near the entrance, a younger man, Carlo DeLuca, Vittorio's cousin, watched with open amusement. He didn't bother lowering his voice. "This is what we're celebrating," he said, raising his glass slightly. "A ghost in a wedding dress?" A few nearby guests chuckled, more openly this time. Carlo's confidence was different from Vittorio's. Louder, less disciplined, the kind that needed witnesses. Elena's eyes moved, not toward Carlo, but past him, toward the staff. Something in the rhythm of the room didn't align. A waiter crossed the floor carrying a tray. His posture was correct, his pace steady, but his gaze flickered once toward the main exit. Too quickly. Another staff member adjusted his cuff. Not unusual, except his sleeve revealed no service insignia. Small things. Individually nothing. Together. A pattern beginning to form. Elena's expression did not change, but her focus sharpened. Behind her, another whisper slipped through the room. "She looks like she wandered in from the wrong life." This time it came closer. Carlo had moved. "Tell me," he said, now standing just a few feet away, his tone casual but edged. "Did anyone bother explaining to you what this family is?" Elena turned her head slightly. "Not fully. Just enough." "I imagine it depends on who's asking," she replied. Carlo smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's a careful answer." "It's an honest one." For a moment the air tightened. Not dramatically, but enough for those paying attention to notice. Vittorio remained still. Watching. Listening. Measuring. Carlo gave a soft laugh and stepped back, lifting his glass again as if the exchange had been nothing more than entertainment. But his eyes lingered. And Elena noticed that too. The music resumed, soft and controlled, filling the spaces between conversations. Yet something beneath it had shifted. Not in the room. In the current running through it. Elena's gaze moved once more, toward the security near the east corridor. One of them adjusted his earpiece. Twice. Not random. A signal. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly. Then she looked back at Vittorio. He hadn't asked a question. Hadn't reacted. But he was watching her now the same way she had been watching the room. As if he understood that something had already begun. Even if no one else had noticed yet. Elena spoke quietly. So quietly that no one else could hear. "Your guests aren't the only ones pretending tonight." Vittorio didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained steady. "Go on," he said. And for the first time since she had entered the room, Elena allowed the silence to stretch. Not out of hesitation, but calculation. Because whatever was unfolding inside that room was no longer about appearances. And very soon, neither would anyone else be. The woman they misjudged. There is a particular kind of mistake people make in rooms like this. They assume that silence means absence. That stillness means uncertainty. That a person who does not compete does not belong. Elena Rossi had spent most of her life allowing people to believe exactly that. She stood beside Vittorio without speaking, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture neither defensive nor performative. Around her, the room continued its quiet choreography. Glasses lifted, alliances reinforced, judgments exchanged and fragments of conversation that never fully surfaced. But Elena wasn't watching the room the way the others were. She wasn't looking for approval. She was looking for inconsistencies. A waiter passed again. Same man, same careful steps. But this time his tray was lighter, though he moved as if it were not. His wrist was tense. Not from strain, from awareness. Elena's eyes followed him briefly, then moved on. Years ago, she had learned how to see like that. Not in rooms like this, but in offices where silence carried a different kind of danger. Back then, Elena Rossi had been known for something else entirely. Precision. She had built a career tracing what others overlooked. Numbers that didn't align, patterns that didn't quite make sense until they were viewed from the right angle. A forensic accountant, they had called her. The kind of professional brought in when something was already wrong, but not yet proven. She didn't chase evidence. She let it reveal itself. It was slower that way, but it was also final. There had been a case, years back now, large enough to draw attention beyond financial circles. A network of shell companies, carefully layered transactions, political names that never appeared directly but were always just close enough to matter. Elena had followed it patiently, piece by piece, until the pattern became undeniable. And then, it disappeared. Not the evidence. The support. The backing that had once made her work legitimate simply withdrew. Files reassigned. Conclusions questioned. Her name, once associated with accuracy, reframed as excessive, speculative. She hadn't fought it. Not publicly. Because by then, she understood something more important than being right. She understood who benefited from her being dismissed. So she stepped away. Not defeated. Just repositioned. And in the years that followed, Elena learned something far more valuable than recognition. She learned how to observe without being seen. Back in the DeLuca estate, that same skill moved quietly beneath the surface of her stillness. Across the room, Carlo laughed again, louder this time, drawing attention as he gestured toward a group of guests. Elena, he called as though testing the name. You've been very quiet. A few heads turned. Elena looked at him, not sharply, not defensively. Just directly. I find it's easier to understand people when they don't know they're being observed. Carlo smirked. That sounds exhausting. It isn't, she replied calmly. It's efficient. A brief pause followed. Not long, but long enough. Vittorio's gaze shifted slightly toward her again. Not because of the words. Because of how little effort it had taken for her to say them. Carlo let out a short laugh and turned away, dismissing her once more, but not quite as easily as before. And that was enough. Elena didn't need to win conversations. She only needed to adjust them. Her attention returned to the room. The security near the east corridor had changed positions. Subtly, one stood half a step closer to the entrance than before. Not enough for most to notice, but enough to alter the line of sight. Another detail. Another piece. Then, the music shifted. Not stopped. Shifted. A fraction slower. Almost imperceptible, unless you were listening for rhythm instead of melody. Elena's gaze lifted toward the musician's platform. One of them avoided looking at the conductor. Not a mistake. A signal. She exhaled slowly. Patterns didn't form all at once. They accumulated. And when they did, they told a story. Behind her, two women continued their quiet assessment. She hasn't smiled once, one whispered. Maybe she doesn't know how, the other replied. Elena heard them. She heard everything. But her focus had already moved beyond them. Because beneath the surface of the evening, beneath the controlled elegance, the carefully managed appearances, something else was beginning to take shape. And it wasn't random. It was coordinated. She glanced once more at Vittorio. He had not moved. But there was a difference now. His stillness was no longer passive. It was engaged. As though he too sensed the shift, without yet naming it. Elena stepped slightly closer to him. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to speak without being overheard. Her voice remained even. Measured. There's a pattern forming, she said quietly. Vittorio did not look at her immediately. What kind of pattern? The kind that depends on timing, Elena replied. A distraction followed by access. A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. And you're certain? He asked. Elena's eyes moved once more across the room. The waiter, the guard, the musician. Each in place. Each waiting. Yes. Vittorio turned his head slightly now, just enough to meet her gaze fully. For a brief moment, the noise of the room seemed to recede. Not physically, but in relevance. Because this was not a conversation built on assumption. It was built on recognition. You saw this before, he said. It wasn't a question. Elena held his gaze. I've seen what happens when people ignore it. Another pause. Longer this time. Vittorio nodded once. A small movement. But deliberate. And somewhere across the room, Carlo raised his glass again. Unaware that the balance of the evening had already begun to shift, Elena stepped back into stillness. The same woman the room had dismissed. The same presence they had reduced to an afterthought. But now, she wasn't just observing the room. She was ahead of it. And whatever was about to unfold, she would see it coming first. Power dynamics, silent recognition. Power, in its most refined form, rarely announces agreement. It doesn't rush to validate. It doesn't react to impress. It listens, and then decides what to do with what it has heard. Vittorio DeLuca stood at the center of the room as though nothing had changed. From the outside it hadn't. The music continued. Conversations resumed their quiet rhythm. Glasses touched. Deals lingered in suggestion rather than statement. The evening, to any casual observer, remained intact, controlled, elegant, predictable. But beneath that surface, a different conversation had already begun. And only two people in the room were part of it. Elena had stepped back into her original position. Her presence once again absorbed into the margins of attention. The same guests who had dismissed her minutes earlier now returned to their assumptions, comforted by the familiarity of their own judgments. That was the advantage of being underestimated. People stopped adjusting around you, which meant you could see them more clearly. Across the hall, the waiter she had been tracking moved again, this time toward the west corridor, where access to the private lounge remained restricted. His path was natural, unforced, but his timing, too precise. Another man near the security detail shifted his stance, not outwardly, not enough to raise suspicion, but his line of sight now intersected with the waiter's path. A connection. Subtle. Intentional. Elena didn't follow them with her gaze this time. She didn't need to. Once a pattern revealed its structure, it rarely changed its nature. Near her, Vittorio lifted his glass slightly, not to drink, but to signal. The movement was almost imperceptible, lost easily among the gestures of a crowded room. But it was seen. One of his men, positioned near the far column, adjusted his posture in response. Not alert. Not aggressive. Just aware. No words were exchanged. They never were. That was the difference between authority and control. Control demanded visibility. Authority operated without it. Carlo, meanwhile, continued his performance. He had gathered a small circle now, his voice just loud enough to carry, his confidence reinforced by the attention he drew. You see, he said, gesturing loosely toward the room. This is what happens when decisions are made without consultation. A few polite smiles. Someone asked, You mean the marriage? Carlo smirked. I mean the message, he replied. Everything sends one. His eyes drifted briefly toward Elena. And this one, he added, is unclear. A soft ripple of agreement followed. But even as he spoke, his attention fractured, just slightly, because something else in the room had begun to move. Not visibly, but structurally. Elena noticed it first in the pacing. The staff no longer moved independently. They moved in sequence. Not synchronized, too obvious. But connected. A delay here. An adjustment there. Each action creating space for the next. She exhaled slowly. Timing. That was the core of it. Not force. Not chaos. Precision. She turned her head slightly toward Vittorio again. He hadn't looked at her. But he was listening. You don't have a perimeter problem, she said quietly, her voice low enough to dissolve into the surrounding noise. A pause. But something close. Something testing. Vittorio turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. No irritation. No reaction. Just presence. Certainty, Vittorio said calmly, is often mistaken for volume. The room quieted slightly, not because of what he said but because he had said it. Carlo held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then smiled. But it didn't reach his eyes. Elena saw that too. And in that brief exchange something aligned. Not confirmed, but closer. Because patterns didn't just exist in movement. They existed in behavior. And Carlo's confidence wasn't as relaxed as it had been before. Elena shifted her attention once more across the room, tracing the sequence again. Waiter, guard, musician. Each still in place. Each still waiting. Whatever was planned hadn't begun yet. But it would. Soon. She stepped slightly closer to Vittorio again, her voice steady. When it starts, she said, it won't look like an attack. Vittorio's response was immediate. It never does. A brief silence settled between them. Not empty. Prepared. Because now the room had changed. Not in appearance, but in awareness. Two people were no longer reacting to the evening. They were ahead of it. And somewhere within the quiet precision of that unfolding pattern, someone else was counting on them not to notice. That would be their mistake. Rising tension and reversal. Intelligence over force. Tension, when it is real, rarely announces itself with noise. It settles first in the details. A hesitation that wasn't there before. A rhythm that shifts just slightly off its natural pace. A moment that passes, but leaves something behind. By the time most people feel it, it's already too late. At the DeLuca estate, the room continued to perform its version of normal. Glasses were refilled. A quiet toast was offered near the center table. Laughter rose, brief, controlled, almost rehearsed. The musicians adjusted their tempo again, smoothing over the earlier inconsistency as though it had never happened. But the structure beneath it all had changed. Elena stood where she had been from the beginning. Still, unassuming, dismissed, and now fully certain. Her eyes moved once more, not searching anymore but confirming. The waiter had reached the west corridor and stopped just short of the restricted entrance. He turned slightly, as if waiting for a cue. The guard position nearby no longer watched the guests. His attention fixed somewhere else, somewhere internal. And the third figure, the one who had stepped out of alignment earlier, had shifted closer to the central aisle. 3 points. Connected. Timed. Elena exhaled slowly. It's not the entrance, she said under her breath. Vittorio stood beside her, his posture unchanged. No, he replied quietly. It's the moment, Elena added. They're waiting for it. A pause. Not confusion. Calculation. What moment? Vittorio asked. Elena's gaze moved toward the raised platform at the front of the hall. The place where attention would inevitably gather. The one everyone is watching, she said. Understanding didn't arrive all at once. It settled. Precisely. Vittorio's eyes followed her line of sight. The central space. The convergence point. The place where visibility would be highest, and awareness the lowest. A distraction disguised as tradition. He nodded once. Not acknowledgement. Decision. Across the room, one of his men adjusted his position again, slightly closer to the corridor. Another shifted near the rear exit. Not enough to alert anyone, but enough to change the outcome of what was coming. Carlo, meanwhile, had grown quieter. Not silent, but attentive. His earlier confidence had softened into something more focused. His eyes moved more frequently now, toward the same points Elena had been watching. That, more than anything, confirmed it. He wasn't just present. He was aware. Elena stepped half a pace closer to Vittorio. They don't expect resistance, she said. They expect confusion. And what do you suggest? Vittorio asked. Elena didn't answer immediately, because the solution wasn't force. Force would validate the plan. What they needed was disruption. Let it begin, she said quietly. Just not the way they planned. A brief silence followed. Then, Vittorio moved. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. He stepped forward just enough to draw a subtle shift in the room's attention. Conversations lowered. A few guests turned instinctively toward him, sensing, not reacting but anticipating. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't call for silence. He simply existed more visibly. And in rooms like this, that was enough. The timing shifted. Barely. But it was there. The waiter near the corridor hesitated. Just for a second. The guard's posture tightened. Not with control, but with uncertainty. And the third figure near the aisle paused. The sequence had been interrupted. Not broken, but delayed. And delay, in a plan built on precision, was risk. Elena watched it unfold with quiet clarity. They're adjusting, she said. Vittorio's response was immediate. So are we. He lifted his hand slightly, not signaling alarm, not issuing command, but altering expectation. Across the room, his men didn't advance. They didn't confront. They simply occupied space differently, blocking lines without appearing to block them, closing distance without closing movement. A quiet recalibration. And suddenly, the room was no longer predictable. The waiter stepped forward again, but now his path was narrower. His exit uncertain. The guard near him shifted again, but this time, he wasn't sure who was watching him. And the third figure stopped completely, because the pattern no longer held. Elena saw the exact moment it collapsed. Not visibly. Internally. When coordination turns into hesitation, the plan is already failing. Carlo moved then. Not toward the center. Toward the corridor. Too quickly. Too directly. And that was enough. Vittorio's gaze settled on him. Not sharply, not accusingly. But completely. Stay where you are, Vittorio said. His voice was calm. But it carried. Not loudly. Clearly. Carlo froze. Not out of obedience. Out of recognition. Because for the first time that evening, the room had stopped playing along. Silence followed. Not forced. Earned. Elena stepped forward slightly now, not into the center, not into visibility, but into alignment with what had just been revealed. Her voice remained low. It was never about entry, she said. It was about timing the reaction. Vittorio nodded once. And now, he asked. Elena looked across the room. At the waiter who no longer moved, at the guard who no longer blended in, at the space that had lost its rhythm. Now they don't have one, she replied. Another pause. Then Vittorio spoke again, this time not to her, but to the room. Close the doors. No urgency. No panique. Just instruction. And this time, no one questioned it. Because whatever had been planned had already been seen. And whatever was meant to unfold in confusion had been answered with something far more dangerous. Clarity. Climax and resolution. The kneeling moment. Control is not proven in the moment things go right. It is revealed in the moment everything is supposed to go wrong, and doesn't. The doors of the DeLuca estate closed with a quiet finality. No Islam. No urgency. Just a sound that carried consequence. For a brief moment no one moved. Not the guests. Not the staff. Not even Carlo. Because something had shifted in a way that could not be easily explained. Only felt. The music had stopped. Not abruptly. But completely. And in its absence, the room became something else. Honest. Vittorio DeLuca stood at the center of that silence. Not elevated. Not performing. Simply present. His gaze moved across the room once. Not searching, not questioning. Confirming. The waiter near the west corridor had lowered his tray. Not dropped it. Not abandoned it. Just lowered it, as if the purpose it once served had quietly dissolved. The guard who had shifted out of alignment earlier now stood too still. No longer blending in, no longer invisible. And the third figure, the one who had paused, had taken half a step back. Not retreating. Reconsidering. Elena remained where she was. Unmoved. Unchanged. And yet, everything around her had adjusted. That was the difference the room was beginning to understand. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded attention. She had not proven herself in any way they recognized. And still, she had altered the outcome of the night. Carlo was the first to break the silence. This is unnecessary, he said, his tone controlled but no longer relaxed. A misunderstanding at best. No one responded. Because even he did not fully believe it. Vittorio turned toward him slowly. Not confrontational. Not aggressive. But complete. A misunderstanding. Vittorio repeated. Carlo nodded, taking a step forward. Careful now, measured. Yes. You're closing doors, stopping the evening. Based on what exactly? A pause followed. Not because Vittorio lacked an answer, but because he was deciding how much of it needed to be said. He didn't look at Carlo when he spoke again. He looked at the room. At a certain level, Vittorio said calmly, people stop making mistakes. Silence. If something is out of place, he continued, it isn't accidental. The words settled heavily. Not loud, but undeniable. Carlo's expression tightened, just slightly. Enough. And you believe that applies here? He asked. This time, Vittorio did look at him. I believe, he said, that tonight was designed to test how closely I pay attention. A longer pause. Then, I don't appreciate being tested. The room absorbed that. Fully. Because now, the situation had moved beyond speculation. It had been named. Not loudly, but clearly enough that no one could ignore it. Elena watched quietly as the understanding spread. Not through panic, not through fear, but through recognition. People began to see what had always been there. The misaligned movements. The subtle coordination. The tension beneath the performance. And then, they began to understand who had seen it first. Vittorio turned slightly. Not toward the center of the room. Toward Elena. It was not a dramatic gesture. But in a room like this, it was definitive. Every eye followed. And for the first time that evening, no one saw her the way they had before. There was no whisper now. No esmirk. No dismissal. Only attention. Measured. Careful. Revised. Vittorio took a step forward. Then another. Until he stood fully between the room and the woman they had underestimated. His voice when he spoke was no louder than before. But it carried further. Kneel. The word landed without force. Without anger. Without explanation. And yet, it moved through the room with absolute clarity. No one asked why. Because the answer had already been given, just not in words. One of the men near the far column was the first. He lowered himself slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed downward. Then another. And another. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Sequential. Like a realization unfolding. Carlo did not move. At first. His eyes shifted. From Vittorio. To Elena. And back again. As if searching for a version of the room that still made sense. But that version was gone. Vittorio, he said quietly. This is excessive. Vittorio didn't respond. Because the moment was no longer a discussion. It was a decision already made. Around Carlo, the room had changed position. Not physically. Structurally. He was no longer part of its center. He was outside of it. And he knew it. Slowly, reluctantly. He lowered himself. Not fully at first. But enough. Enough to acknowledge what had just been established. Silence followed again. Deeper now. Settled. Vittorio turned his attention back to Elena. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Because nothing immediate needed to be said. The room itself had already delivered the message. Still. He stepped closer. Just enough. You saw it before it existed, he said quietly. Elena met his gaze. I saw what it would become, she replied. A brief pause. Then Vittorio nodded. Not as a gesture of approval, but recognition. Of alignment. Of value. Of something far more enduring than appearance. He turned back to the room. They saw a distraction, he said evenly. I saw discipline. No one moved. No one spoke. Because now, there was nothing left to misunderstand. The evening had not been interrupted. It had been revealed. And Elena, the woman they had dismissed, reduced, overlooked, had not changed at all. Only their perception of her had. She stood where she had always stood. Calm. Unshaken. Unapologetic. But now, no one in that room could afford to ignore her. And more importantly, no one would ever laugh again.